Imagine this. Your sworn enemy has just unleashed the most unexpected and devastating assault in military annals, shattering your forward defenses and cleaving your forces in two. This was the grim reality General Dwight Eisenhower confronted on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler orchestrated his final desperate gamble deep within the Belgian woodlands. American units were in full flight, communication channels were obliterated, and a wave of apprehension swept through the Allied ranks. The triumph in Europe, seemingly within grasp mere days prior, now teetered precariously. Yet, in those direst moments, when defeat loomed large for the Allies, Eisenhower made a pivotal command decision, one of the most debated yet brilliant of the Second World War. His decree was so audacious it would secure the Western alliance and ultimately seal Hitler's doom. This is the account of how a single directive, issued against fierce opposition from his own senior officers, transformed an impending catastrophe into an unparalleled triumph. Dwight David Eisenhower, born in 1890 to a pacifist family in Texas and raised in Kansas, had ascended from relative obscurity to command the largest armed force humanity had ever witnessed. By December of 1944, the young man from Abilene, who had never experienced combat in the Great War, now held the rank of five-star general, directing millions of Allied soldiers across Western Europe. His meteoric rise had commenced a mere 3 years earlier, when he was simply a colonel devising simulated conflicts in Louisiana. Following the triumphant Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, an endeavor meticulously planned by Eisenhower and initiated with his now iconic Order of the Day proclaiming, "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade." Allied armies had swept across France and Belgium. By autumn, the war's conclusion seemed inevitable. German forces were in retreat on all fronts, and Allied commanders were already anticipating victory parades. However, Hitler still possessed a final stratagem. The Führer, disregarding counsel from his own generals, had been secretly amassing his last remaining reserves for a massive counter-offensive. His objective? The thinly defended Ardennes Forest, the very path his panzer divisions had exploited with devastating effect in 1940. A successful incursion would bifurcate the British and American armies, recapture the crucial port of Antwerp, and potentially compel the Western Allies to pursue a separate peace. Eisenhower's ascent to Supreme Commander had been characterized by his remarkable capacity to grasp the overarching strategic picture, while others were preoccupied with minor engagements. His mentor, Army Chief of Staff George Marshal, had discerned something extraordinary in the Kansas farm boy, who toiled until 10 at night without complaint. Unlike his peers who focused on tactical victories, Eisenhower understood that World War II was as much about managing complex alliances as it was about winning battles. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Eisenhower had sharpened his skills as a coalition leader during the North African and Italian campaigns. He learned to navigate the intricate personalities and nationalistic pride of Allied statesmen, deftly mediating tensions between British imperial ambitions and American directness, and reconciling Montgomery's methodical approach with Patton's aggressive tactics. These experiences would prove invaluable when he faced his greatest challenge. During the campaigns in Western Europe, officers from 9 different nationalities served on his headquarters staff. Eisenhower's genius extended beyond military strategy. It lay in his ability to forge disparate Allied contingents into a cohesive, unified force. This proficiency would be tested to its absolute limit within the frigid expanse of the Ardennes. December 16, 1944, was slated to be a day of celebration for Eisenhower. He had recently been elevated to the rank of General of the Army and was eagerly anticipating attending the wedding of his orderly, Mickey McKee, in Versailles. The conflict in Europe appeared to be all but concluded. Allied forces had traversed hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches and were poised to advance into Germany itself. Then, an urgent message arrived, a whisper that would irrevocably alter the course of events. As dawn broke on December the 16th, over 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks commenced Adolf Hitler's final, desperate gamble. The assault materialized precisely where the Allies least anticipated it, through the dense Ardennes Forest, which they had deemed unsuitable for a major offensive. 3 German armies began systematically dismantling American divisions that were either depleted by prior engagements or, in some instances, had yet to face combat. The situation was dire. American forces, caught entirely unawares, were in full retreat. Communication lines were severed, supply depots were overrun, and a palpable sense of panic permeated the ranks. By December 24th, German forces had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River, threatening to completely sever the Allied armies. Yet Eisenhower refused to perceive this as an insurmountable disaster. At a critical meeting convened in Verdun on December 19th, he set a resolute tone. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. While his generals saw impending defeat, Eisenhower envisioned possibilities. The Germans had abandoned their established defensive lines, exposing themselves to counterattack. The immediate challenge became coordinating a response amidst dispersed forces and disrupted communications. This was the juncture that would define Eisenhower's enduring legacy. The German offensive had achieved more than merely breaching American lines. It had severed communication between General Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his northern armies. General Simpson's Ninth Army and General Hodges's First Army were effectively isolated from their command structure. The seemingly obvious solution was to dispatch reinforcements and reinforce the existing defenses. However, Eisenhower recognized a more profound issue: command and control. How could scattered Allied units coordinate an effective counter-assault when they were unable to communicate with one another? The solution necessitated unprecedented cooperation between allies who had, throughout the war, competed for prestige and resources. When Eisenhower queried Patton regarding the speed with which he could launch an offensive northward to alleviate the pressure, Patton astonished all present by promising to strike on December the 22nd with 3 divisions. The prospect of redeploying entire divisions under winter conditions within 72 hours appeared utterly improbable. Nevertheless, Patton had already initiated his meticulous planning. Yet, even Patton's brilliant maneuver would not suffice. The northern flank of the German breakthrough demanded immediate attention, and Bradley's headquarters was incapable of providing it. Someone had to assume command of those isolated American units, orchestrate their defense, and prepare for a counter-assault. That individual would have to be Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On December the 19th, General Eisenhower issued what he himself acknowledged as a controversial directive, placing all troops, American and British, north of the German salient under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery. This decision ignited immediate indignation among American commanders who viewed it as a humiliating demotion. Bradley was incandescent with rage. Patton was apoplectic. The American press would subsequently condemn it as a capitulation to British arrogance. However, Eisenhower comprehended what his critics failed to grasp. This was not about national pride. It was about winning the war. The decision to place American forces under British command had been initially proposed by General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. Yet, Eisenhower made the ultimate determination, fully aware of the political storm it would provoke. Montgomery was geographically closer to the northern sector, possessed superior communication capabilities, and had fresh reserve units that could be rapidly deployed. The controversy was immediate and intense. American generals felt profoundly insulted. Bradley would later attribute the failure to launch a counterattack when ordered by Eisenhower to Montgomery's stagnant conservatism. Some historians have argued that Montgomery exhibited excessive caution and that American forces could have managed the situation independently. Nevertheless, the outcome spoke louder than personal pride. Montgomery deserves considerable credit for stabilizing the situation due to his efficient and disciplined system of subordinate control. Within hours of assuming command, Montgomery had repositioned British reserves southward to secure the Meuse River bridges, thereby preventing the German forces from achieving their strategic breakthrough. More significantly, the decision preserved Allied unity at a moment of extreme peril. Hitler had harbored the hope of exploiting existing disputes between Montgomery and Bradley, believing he could fracture the alliance during a crisis. Instead, Eisenhower's willingness to subordinate American ego to Allied effectiveness demonstrated the unshakable integrity of the Western coalition. The ethical dimension of Eisenhower's decision cannot be overlooked. He had personally witnessed the horrors of Nazi occupation. On April 11, 1945, Eisenhower visited the Ohrdruf concentration camp and was profoundly affected by what he observed. He understood that this war transcended national glory. It was about safeguarding human dignity against totalitarian evil. The contentious command decision was merely the prelude. On December 22, 1944, Eisenhower issued his order of the day to all Allied forces. By rushing out from his fixed defenses, the enemy may give us the chance to turn his great gamble into his worst defeat. So I call upon every man of all the Allies to rise now to new heights of courage, of resolution, and of effort. The directive perfectly encapsulated Eisenhower's strategic foresight. The Germans, by abandoning their fortified positions, had rendered themselves vulnerable. Now was the opportune moment to annihilate them in the open. The weather, which had initially favored the Germans by grounding Allied aircraft, began to improve. American air power returned to the skies with devastating impact. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled in the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne, fought valiantly under siege. When the German commander demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously responded with a single word that became legendary: nuts. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army breached German lines and relieved Bastogne. To the north, the 2nd U.S. Armored Division halted enemy tanks just short of the Meuse River on Christmas Day. Montgomery's strategically positioned reserves prevented any German advance in the northern sector. By January 8th, German forces within the western half of the salient had collapsed, and within another week, the Germans were in full retreat. By January 16th, precisely 1 month after its commencement, forces from the 1st and 3rd American armies linked up, signaling the beginning of the end of the conflict. The cost was staggering. Over 105,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or missing, roughly 1 out of every 10 American casualties for the entire war. However, German losses were even more substantial. German forces suffered the loss of 120,000 personnel and vast quantities of military materiel, sustaining an irreparable blow. More critically, Hitler's offensive capability was irrevocably destroyed. Never again would Hitler be able to launch an offensive in the West on such a scale. The Battle of the Bulge became Hitler's Waterloo, his final wager that backfired catastrophically. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Yet, it was more than an American triumph. It was an Allied victory, made possible by Eisenhower's willingness to prioritize Allied effectiveness over national pride. The command decision, so intensely debated in December 1944, was ultimately vindicated by its results. Montgomery's efficient coordination of the northern defenses, coupled with Patton's swift counterattack from the south, created a perfectly executed pincer movement that shattered German hopes. The two generals, so divergent in temperament and methodology, were unified by Eisenhower's strategic vision. The Battle of the Bulge cemented Eisenhower's reputation as the indispensable commander of Allied forces, capable of managing strong-willed subordinates, navigating intricate international politics, and making difficult choices under immense pressure. His decision to grant Montgomery command over American forces north of the Bulge demonstrated that true leadership sometimes necessitates enduring criticism to achieve victory. The psychological impact was equally profound. German morale, which had momentarily soared during the initial days of the offensive, was permanently broken. All 10 of the German panzer divisions that had fought in Normandy had been reconstituted using cadres of battle-hardened men who had survived earlier defeats. 9 of these 10 reconstituted divisions were annihilated in the Bulge, and the veterans who might have formed the core of future German resistance were eliminated. Eisenhower's decision during the Battle of the Bulge illuminates the fundamental nature of coalition warfare and reveals timeless leadership principles extending far beyond military strategy. Unlike purely national military operations, coalition warfare demands leaders who can perceive beyond their nation's immediate interests to the broader strategic panorama. As Eisenhower himself reflected, humility must always be the portion of any man who receives acclaim earned in the blood of his followers and the sacrifices of his friends. The decision also highlights the critical distinction between management and leadership in times of crisis. A manager would have adhered to established chains of command and been preoccupied with bureaucratic sensitivities, perhaps convening meetings to deliberate options while German tanks advanced towards the Meuse River. A leader, however, recognized that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, that protocol must yield to efficacy when lives hang in the balance. Eisenhower chose outcomes over popularity, mission success over personal comfort. What made this decision particularly remarkable was its counterintuitive nature. Every fiber of American military culture suggested that placing U.S. forces under foreign command signified failure. The American press would later savagely critique the decision as a capitulation to British arrogance. Congressional critics would question whether Eisenhower possessed the fortitude necessary for supreme command. Yet Eisenhower understood that genuine strength sometimes requires projecting weakness, that authentic leadership occasionally demands accepting blame to achieve victory. The decision also illustrates how crises reveal character in ways that peacetime never can. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, Eisenhower had proven himself to be a competent administrator and a capable diplomat. However, the Battle of the Bulge tested something deeper: his capacity to make decisions that would be judged by history rather than by newspaper headlines, decisions that would save lives rather than preserve reputations. Perhaps most significantly, Eisenhower's choice reflected a sophisticated grasp of the war's true essence. This was not merely a contest between armies or even nations. It was a struggle between two fundamentally divergent conceptions of human civilization. Hitler's regime embodied the principle that might makes right, that superior races were destined to dominate inferior ones, and that individual dignity was inconsequential compared to state power. The Western Allies, despite their own imperfections and national rivalries, represented something different: the idea that free peoples could voluntarily cooperate for common objectives, that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, and that rational discourse could resolve conflicts that authoritarianism could only suppress. Eisenhower's willingness to subordinate American pride to Allied effectiveness embodied these principles in action. The long-term ramifications of this leadership philosophy would extend far beyond World War II. When Eisenhower later assumed the presidency, he would apply the same approach to forging the NATO alliance, navigating congressional opposition, and managing the complex realities of Cold War diplomacy. The skills he demonstrated in the Ardennes, patience with difficult allies, focus on long-term objectives, and a willingness to accept criticism for unpopular but necessary decisions, would define American leadership during the most perilous era of the 20th century. However, the Battle of the Bulge also revealed something profound about the American character itself. The soldiers who fought in those frozen forests exemplified what Eisenhower would later term the willingness and readiness of Americans to endure greatly in their country's cause. They had overcome not only enemy fire, but also the psychological terror of a surprise attack, the disorientation of shattered communications, and the despair that arises when victory abruptly transforms into potential defeat. These men, young men from farms and factories, from suburbs and cities, had proven that democratic societies could produce warriors as resolute and determined as any totalitarian regime. They fought not out of compulsion or fear of their own government, but because they understood the profound principles for which they were contending. In the words of Eisenhower's D-Day order, they carried the hope and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere. 3 months after the Battle of the Bulge concluded, Eisenhower stood in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, witnessing German officers sign the unconditional surrender that brought World War II in Europe to its end. At 2 o'clock in the morning on May 7, 1945, with Eisenhower awaiting in an adjacent room, General Alfred Jodl signed the German instrument of surrender. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. Yet victory had come at an extraordinary price. Between America's entry into World War II in 1941 and VE Day on May 8, 1945, more than 300,000 American soldiers had perished in combat. Other allies suffered even greater losses, with nearly 500,000 British troops and a staggering 7.5 million Soviet troops dying in battle. The young man from Abilene, who had never aspired to be a soldier, had become the architect of the greatest military victory in American history. His decision to place Allied effectiveness above American pride embodied the very spirit that made that victory possible. Today, as we confront new challenges that necessitate international cooperation, Eisenhower's example remains profoundly relevant. He understood that true strength does not stem from insisting on doing everything oneself, but from building coalitions robust enough to surmount any obstacle. In the frozen forests of Belgium, when American forces were cornered and defeat seemed inevitable, one man's willingness to make an unpopular decision preserved the Western alliance and altered the course of history. The Germans had them trapped, but Eisenhower's order empowered Montgomery to command the northern sector. Patton struck from the south, and Hitler's final gamble became his ultimate undoing. Sometimes, the most critical battles are won not by generals seeking personal glory, but by leaders who comprehend that victory belongs to all or to none at all. As Eisenhower had penned in his D-Day order, we will accept nothing less than full victory. In the Ardennes Forest, facing his ultimate test, he delivered precisely that. Full victory, achieved through leadership that prioritized the mission over ego, alliance over nationalism, and ultimate triumph over ephemeral pride. The tide had turned, but it turned because one man understood that the greatest strength resides in unity, even when that unity demands the most difficult of decisions.